Hi, Mompreneurs. This is Angela, your host of the Good Enough Mompreneur podcast. Thank you for joining me on this episode where I'm going to talk about 5 steps to landing your first podcast guest spot without a PR team. And I am so excited to talk about this topic because after 3 seasons of hosting a podcast, I have seen more than 1,000 guest pitches. And I've also been on other podcasts myself. And so I've really had an opportunity to see those who maximize their opportunity, those who do it successfully without a PR team. And I'm all about empowering mom entrepreneurs, especially, or any entrepreneur, on how to get their message out there. So if you have ever dreamed of sharing your story on a podcast, but really feel overwhelmed about the process, where to start, this episode is for you. Maybe you thought you need a fancy PR agent or an assistant to get noticed, but guess what? You don't. So today I'm sharing 5 simple steps for you to land your first podcast guest spot all on your own. I've seen a lot of guest pitches, and I've seen them kind of not be as great lately. And so I thought I really need to serve entrepreneurs on how to do it successfully and maximize the opportunity once you land a guest spot. And I have been on some episodes recently. You can go to my media page, which I'll link in the show notes below, which has all of my podcast guest spots. It's really been a powerful way to expand my business and expand my brand and get better at understanding my offer, get to know new audiences. It's really a powerful tool to expand your business. Landing a guest spot isn't about hiring a PR team or even having a huge following. It's about presenting your story and your expertise in a way that connects with the host and their audience. And today I'm sharing the exact 5 steps you'll need to take. And if you stick around to the end, I'm going to tell you how you can get my free guide that will summarize all of these steps and go in a little bit more detail for you. So be sure you stay to the end, and I'll let you know how you can get that totally for free. Before we get into the 5 steps, I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about why podcast guesting is so powerful. Some of the benefits are you're creating a really intimate, long-form conversation and building trust with not only the podcast host, but their audience. And some of the statistics out there about the growth of podcasts are really incredible. It's almost half of all Americans listen to podcasts. And then what is really important for you to understand is that 68% of podcast listeners say they've purchased a product or service that they've heard about on a podcast. And that just shows you how much trust you're building. Unlike ads, podcasts allow you to connect authentically with an engaged audience, and people don't just hear you, they get to know you. And the really wonderful thing about podcasts is that it is long-form content. It's going to sit and continue to help you grow your business over the long term. So as mompreneurs and spiritual entrepreneurs, we're all about alignment and connection, right? And so podcasting gives you the space to share your purpose. And then what is really great as a mom is podcast guesting can really work for you when we have such busy schedules. You can choose a time that works for you or work with the podcast to hopefully find a time if they really want to have you on that. Like I've been on podcasts where I've had to do it late at night because I knew the mom who was a host had little ones who were sleeping, and so I was happy to do that. So it can be something that can have a really flexible schedule, and of course it's usually always remote. So let's dive in to the actual 5 steps to becoming a podcast guest. And one of the first things that you need to do is to identify the right podcast to be on. And it's not just any podcast, it's not only big podcasts. So start with podcasts that align with your niche and the audience you serve. And how do you actually do that? One really great tool is Listen Notes in Apple Podcasts. And another one is a FeedSpot or FM player. You can find some different niches of podcasts that align with your business. Maybe not somebody who's doing something exactly what you're doing, so they don't feel like, maybe they're going to cut into my client base, but you're going to amplify or serve their listeners in a new way. One of the things that you also need to do is make sure that you check recent episodes. Are they publishing episodes regularly? And are they publishing on the major platforms? Some people only publish their podcasts internally, and that's not necessarily something that you want to put your time and effort into. You want to be sure that they are posting them on iHeartRadio and Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Some of the big streaming services, do they post regularly? Do they have a website? What do they do with their podcast episodes on their website? Do they feature you? I feature all of my podcast guests with an additional blog from the episode. So there are multiple ways that we feature our guests. And so I think that makes it really appealing for guests to be on our podcast. After you have started to identify the podcasts that you want to be on, I want to make sure that you're not overlooking smaller podcasts. I would recommend them at least have maybe 10 episodes or something like that. But just because a podcast is new or small, it doesn't seem like it has a very big audience, doesn't mean that it's not worth your time to be on the show. And you might be way more likely to be on a smaller podcast than some of the larger podcasts because they get tons of pitches all of the time, and it would be much more difficult to stand out in that audience. Step number 2 is crafting an irresistible pitch. Your pitch is your ticket. And one of the things that you need to remember most when it comes to pitching to be a podcast guest is that, one, you want to make sure that the podcast feels that you know about their podcast, who their audience is, and have listened to some episodes. That's really helpful. And then 2, you want to also help them understand how you will give value to their audience. And you want to make it a really easy yes for the podcast host and their team. And so how you do that is you make sure that you include all of the information that they will need to make the decision easy, that you are well aligned with their audience. You're going to provide benefit. And one of the biggest mistakes that I see is somebody will reach out to be on my podcast who does the same thing as a recent episode. And if I did a recent episode on a certain topic, I don't necessarily always want to book somebody who does the same thing or in the same field. So if you do feel called to reach out to be a guest, distinguish yourself from a recent episode or an episode that had a similar topic. So make sure you do that research as well. Most likely the podcast host or their team will do that research to make sure that they're not covering the same topic over and over. Step number 3, you're going to want to create a professional one sheet. And this is so important. And this really goes to number 2 in that it makes it so easy for the team to say yes. So A one sheet is like your business card in podcasting. It makes it easy for the host to say yes, like I said. So some things to include in a one sheet are a short bio, suggested topic and questions. They might not use those questions exactly, but it's a really great guide. And then links to your website and your social. So the podcast host and the team can check you out. Sometimes you might even include a link to a prior podcast episode that you were on. That's not necessary, but definitely a little bio, some topics, and links to your social media and website, if you have one. Hopefully you have one. And pro tip here, you can easily use Canva to create one of these pretty easily. And then it is also helpful if you include a picture with that kind of conveys who you are and some of your personality. That's always helpful. So let's say you get the podcast interview. And so how do you prepare? And that's step number 4. You want to research the audience, putting together an outline of some key points that you want to cover. And sometimes, most of the time, I send some questions ahead of time. That's something that you can request as well. But not every podcast is going to do that. But also, before the podcast, make sure you know whether you're going to appear via video or is it going to be just audio. And then making sure you dress accordingly, I guess, depending on how you want to convey your message. And then just testing your mic and doing all those things ahead of time and making sure that you're in a quiet space. And here is a little energetic tip for you. Take a few deep breaths and do a grounding meditation before your podcast appearance. That really helps to calm your nerves and align your energy and make sure that you're connecting with the host and also the audience. So let's talk about the final step 5, which is leveraging your episode post-recording. And this is so important, and this is something I really see guests they've done all this work to be on the show. They looked at the questions, they appeared, they make sure they look great, but the episode launches and they do nothing with it. They don't share it with their audience. Sometimes they don't even respond to our email saying, hey, your episode is live. Because really you're creating a network. You're creating a relationship with that podcast host. And there's so much opportunity post-recording to get more out of your time spent with that podcast. So your job doesn't end when the interview is over. Promote the episode on social media and your email list. Thank the host with a genuine note. This is not something that is required, but it really goes to that creating a network and building a relationship with that podcast host if you do send them a note. And it's so appreciated. And it opens the door to future collaborations and working together. They might want to actually work with you and use your services. I have used the services of some of my podcast guests. So sometimes you might even be able to connect so much with the podcast host, they will want to hire you. Also, when it goes to promoting the episode, try to connect with that person on LinkedIn. That's really wonderful. Or on socials, connect with them. If they had you on their podcast, it's so appreciated if you leave a review for the podcast. And I've had authors on my podcast and I've truly read their books and left a review for their books. And in exchange, they can leave a review for the podcast or whatnot. And when you leave a review, it really helps the podcast and it also really helps others find your episode once it's released. So it's a really great thing to do in the relationship building part of being a podcast. You can repurpose the content. You can pull quotes and sound bites from the episode, ask for clips, ask for the raw video or audio, and that will enable you to do some of those things. I know that You might be thinking, okay, great. Those 5 steps sound pretty easy, but you might still have some doubts that you would be able to secure a podcast guest spot for yourself. You might be thinking, I'm not big enough to be on a podcast. And the truth is, every podcast needs guests. Those who don't just do solo episodes, which I think there are few and far between that only do solo episodes, but they need guests who add value to the audience. And it's not about fame, it is truly about connection. Another myth is that you're going to show up on the podcast and not know what to say. So the best podcast interviews are just conversations. That's all they are. They're not speeches. Just share your story authentically, and that is what really connects with the host and the audience. I honestly think those episodes where people are not overly preparing really do the best. So don't talk yourself out of securing a podcast guest spot for yourself. It is such a powerful way to grow your business. Those are the 5 steps, and every time you do it, you're going to get better at it. And you don't need to have it all figured out to start. You just need to take the first step. Your story matters, and there's an audience absolutely waiting to hear it. So many listen to podcasts, and it's only growing. And so, like I said, it's long form content that's going to be there for a long time. I wouldn't necessarily expect an immediate impact from being on a podcast, especially a smaller one, but you never know. It's always there. And so it's always there to benefit you. So with that, if you're ready to take action, you can download my 5-step guide to becoming a podcast guest without a PR team. It walks you through everything we talked about today, plus includes bonus tips to make the process even easier. So click on the link down in the show notes. So thank you for tuning in today for this episode. I appreciate your time. I hope you found it valuable. I hope that I planted the seed of how much being a podcast guest can grow your business. I have grown my network and also my business by being a podcast guest, and it can absolutely work for you. I don't think that it's because I have a podcast that has a certain amount of listeners or episodes. I think it really is about finding that aligned podcast and also sharing my story authentically. Download my list, and I hope it inspires you to take action to start securing your podcast guest spots. And if the guide helps you do that, reach out, let me know. Let me know if you have any questions from the guide. And until next time, keep amplifying your voice and sharing your magic with the world. I'm your host, Angela Mashuli. Thank you so much. If you love this episode, be sure to follow us for more episodes just like this. We have a solo episode every other week. We have a new interview every Monday with amazing entrepreneurs, thought leaders, speakers that provide so much value. So I can't wait to talk to you on the next episode, and thanks so much for joining us.